the king!
Welcome to Esoteric Guardian. Today we're going to talk about something that has haunted the corridors of power since the dawn of civilization itself. An obsession so deep, so carefully guarded, that it has survived the fall of empires, the rise of republics, and even the supposed enlightenment of the modern age. So let me ask you this: where does this obsession with blood purity come from? Why do the world's most powerful families insist they descend from the same ancient gods? And more importantly, what are they really trying to preserve? Because here's what nobody wants to admit. This isn't a modern conspiracy theory. This is an ancient belief system that has been carefully maintained, adapted, and hidden in the plain sight for thousands of years. And if you look closely enough, you'll see that the same symbols, the same claims, and the same families keep appearing throughout history, connected by an invisible thread that stretches back to the very first kings who walked the earth. Today, we're going to follow that thread. From the clay tablets of Mesopotamia to the coronation ceremonies of European monarchs, we're going to trace the origins of the most powerful idea that has ever shaped human civilization. The idea that some humans are not quite human, that they carry the blood of gods. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll never look at royal weddings, political dynasties, or the symbols on currency the same way again. Let's start with something you can verify right now. Pick any major political dynasty, any royal family, any old money billionaire clan. Now look up their family tree. Go back far enough, and you'll find something curious. They all trace their lineage back to nobility, and that nobility traces back to royalty. And that royalty, they claim descent from gods. The British royal family, they trace their line back to Woden, the Anglo-Saxon name for Odin. The Merovingian dynasty of France claimed descent from a sea creature, mixing with the Trojans who fled to Europe. The Japanese imperial family claims unbroken descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu. The Dalai Lamas are believed to be reincarnations of Avalokiteshvara, a divine being. Even the Rothschilds and Rockefellers, when you dig deep enough, connect to old European bloodlines that made the same ancient claims. This isn't coincidence. This is deliberate. This is genealogy as religion. Now you might be thinking, sure, but that's just ego. Rich people like to pretend they're special. And yes, that's partially true, but here's where it gets interesting. These families don't just claim divine ancestry for prestige. They behave as if they genuinely believe it. They marry within strict circles. They maintain elaborate records going back centuries. They use specific symbols that have remained virtually unchanged for thousands of years. The eagle, the lion, the dragon, the serpent, the sun. Why would they do this if it was just theater? Why maintain this charade for generation after generation? Long after the world stopped believing in the divine right of kings. Because to them, it's not theater. To them, this is science. This is the preservation of something they believe is real. A genetic legacy that traces back not to human origins, but to something older. Something that walked the earth before modern humanity even existed. The elite don't just study history, they obsess over it. They fund archaeological digs in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley. They collect ancient texts and artifacts. They infiltrate academic institutions and control the narrative about human origins. And when you look at what they're searching for, you start to see a pattern. They're looking for proof. Proof that the old stories were true. Proof that they really do carry the blood of the gods. And the strangest part? The historical record actually supports their claims. Not in the way they present it publicly, but in the way the ancient texts themselves describe it. Because when you go back to the beginning, to the very first civilizations that left written records, you find something remarkable. They all tell the same story. The story of when gods walked among men, when they ruled as kings, and when they mixed their blood with humanity to create a hybrid lineage designed to rule in their absence. This is where our investigation really begins. Not in the conspiracy theories of the internet age, but in the clay tablets of the oldest known civilization, in a place where history and mythology blend so seamlessly that even modern scholars can't tell where one ends and the other begins. We're going back to Sumer, to Mesopotamia, to the cradle of civilization itself, because that's where the bloodline begins. That's where the gods first chose their representatives on Earth, and that's where the obsession with preserving divine ancestry was born. Imagine you're an archaeologist in the 1900s, brushing dust off clay tablets in what is now Iraq. You're translating cuneiform script, one of humanity's oldest writing systems, and as you decode these ancient texts, you start to realize something unsettling. These aren't just myths. These are records, administrative documents, king lists, genealogies, and they're claiming something impossible. I'm talking about the Sumerian king list, one of the most fascinating and controversial documents in archaeology. It's not a story, it's a list, a chronological record of every king who ruled in Sumer before and after a great flood. And here's where it gets weird. The first 8 kings on this list supposedly ruled for thousands of years. Not hundreds, thousands. The first king, Alulim, ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalgar, ruled for 36,000 years. These weren't considered mythological figures by the Sumerians. They were documented as historical rulers, part of an unbroken chain of kingship that stretched back to when kingship descended from heaven. That phrase right there, when kingship descended from heaven, it appears over and over in Sumerian texts. The idea wasn't that humans developed leadership naturally. The idea was that leadership was a divine gift, bestowed by the gods upon chosen individuals who carried their essence. Now, modern scholars dismiss these extreme lifespans as symbolic or mythological, but here's what they struggle to explain. Why would the Sumerians, who were meticulous record keepers, who invented mathematics and astronomy, who built the first cities and irrigation systems, suddenly become wildly fantastical when recording their own history? The Sumerians didn't see a distinction between history and mythology the way we do. To them, the gods were as real as the kings, and the kings were as real as the gods because they carried divine blood. This is where we meet the Anunnaki. Now, I know this term has been co-opted by every conspiracy theory on the internet, but let's look at what the actual texts say. The Anunnaki were described as a group of deities in Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian mythology. The name literally means those of royal blood or princely offspring. They were considered the children of An, the sky god, and Kai, the earth goddess. According to the texts, these beings came from the heavens and established civilization on Earth. They taught humans agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, and law. They built cities, and most importantly, they intermarried with humans to create a hybrid bloodline that could rule in their stead. This wasn't seen as metaphor. This was presented as genealogical fact. Enter Gilgamesh, perhaps the most famous figure from this era. The Epic of Gilgamesh is considered one of humanity's oldest written stories. But Gilgamesh wasn't just a character in a myth. He was listed as the 5th king of Uruk in the Sumerian king list. And according to the texts, he was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. His mother was the goddess Ninsun. His father was a mortal king. Think about what that means. The Sumerians weren't claiming their king was chosen by the gods. They were claiming their king was a god, or at least part god, a hybrid, designed to bridge the gap between the divine and the mortal. Gilgamesh's entire epic revolves around his struggle with mortality. He watches his friend Enkidu die and becomes obsessed with finding immortality. He travels to the ends of the earth to find Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood, who was granted eternal life by the gods. And when Gilgamesh fails to achieve immortality, he returns to Uruk and focuses on his legacy, the walls he built, the kingdom he ruled, the bloodline he would pass down. This is the prototype for every royal dynasty that would follow, the attempt to preserve divine essence through bloodline, the belief that power isn't just political, it's genetic. It's literally in the blood. Now here's where the story takes a turn that every ancient culture seems to remember: the flood. The Sumerian texts describe a great deluge that wiped out most of humanity. The reason? The gods decided that humanity had become too numerous, too noisy, too troublesome. But one man, Ziusudra, in the Sumerian version, was warned by the god Enki to build a boat and preserve life. Sound familiar? It should, because this same story appears in Babylonian texts as the Epic of Atrahasis. It appears in Akkadian texts as the story of Utnapishtim. And yes, it appears in the Hebrew Bible as Noah's flood. But here's what most people miss. After the flood, the king list continues. Kingship, it says, descended from heaven again. New kings arose, but they no longer lived for thousands of years. The direct bloodline had been diluted. The connection to the gods had weakened, but the memory remained. And so did the obsession with preserving it. The Sumerian civilization eventually collapsed, absorbed by the Akkadians, then the Babylonians, then the Assyrians. But the idea that they created, the idea that kingship was divine inheritance, that certain bloodlines carried the essence of the gods, that idea didn't die. It migrated, it evolved, and it found its perfect expression in a kingdom that would dominate the ancient world for 3,000 years. A kingdom where the king wasn't just blessed by the gods, he was a god, walking the earth in human form. We're going to Egypt. If Sumer was where the idea of divine kingship was born, Egypt was where it became religion, where it became law, where it became the very foundation of civilization itself. In Egypt, they didn't just claim the pharaoh was descended from gods, they claimed the pharaoh was a god, a living deity, the physical incarnation of Horus, maintaining cosmic order through his mere existence. This wasn't symbolic. This was genuine theological doctrine, maintained with absolute conviction for over 3,000 years. Let me put that in perspective. Ancient Egyptian civilization lasted longer than the time between the fall of Rome and today, longer than Christianity has existed. For 3,000 years, every single ruler of Egypt was considered divine, not chosen by God, not appointed by God, but literally, physically, a god incarnate. How do you maintain a system like that? Through ritual, through architecture that defies human capability, and most importantly, through bloodline control so strict it would horrify modern genetics. The pharaohs practiced systematic royal incest. Brothers married sisters, fathers married daughters. This wasn't about political alliance. This was about purity, about keeping the divine blood undiluted. Look at Tutankhamun. DNA analysis revealed he was the product of a brother-sister union. His father was Akhenaten, his mother was Akhenaten's sister, and Tut himself married his half-sister. This level of inbreeding had devastating consequences. Tutankhamun had a clubfoot, a cleft palate, and likely died from complications related to genetic disorders. But here's the thing, they knew. The ancient Egyptians could see the physical problems that arose from these unions. And they did it anyway, because to them, physical deformity was a small price to pay for maintaining divine essence. The pharaoh's body might be weak, but his blood was pure. And that blood carried something they believed was infinitely more important than physical health, the divine right to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic order. The pharaoh wasn't just a political leader, he was a cosmic necessity. Without him, without his divine blood performing the correct rituals, the entire universe would collapse into chaos. The Nile would stop flooding. The sun would stop rising. This is why the pharaoh's death was so traumatic. It wasn't just the loss of a leader, it was a cosmic crisis. The god had died, and until the new pharaoh was crowned, Egypt was in existential danger. The crowning ceremony itself was deeply esoteric. The new pharaoh would enter the temple as a man and emerge as Horus. He would receive the crook and flail, symbols of his role as shepherd and provider. He would receive the uraeus, the cobra on his crown. He would receive the false beard, connecting him to Osiris. And most importantly, he would receive the 5 royal names, each one affirming his divine nature. The Horus name, the Nebdi name, the Golden Horus name, the throne name connecting him to Ra, and the birth name now preceded by Son of Ra. Every element reinforced one message. This person is not human anymore. The divine essence has entered him. He is God made flesh. But here's what reveals how these bloodline obsessions actually work. Despite all this rhetoric about divine blood, Egyptian succession wasn't always smooth. There were coups. There were entire dynasties founded by generals with no blood connection to previous pharaohs. So how did they maintain the fiction of divine bloodline? Simple. They married into it. The throne might be taken by force, but divine legitimacy could only be inherited through blood, specifically through the female line. While the pharaoh was Horus, the queen was often seen as the incarnation of Isis or Hathor. She carried the divine spark, and any king who wanted true legitimacy needed to mix his blood with hers. This is why royal women in Egypt had far more power than in almost any other ancient civilization. They weren't just consorts, they were vessels of divinity. And in some cases, like Hatshepsut or Cleopatra, they ruled as pharaohs themselves. Now, as Egyptian civilization declined, invaded by Persians, conquered by Alexander, absorbed into the Roman Empire, you might think this system would collapse. But it didn't. The idea was too powerful, too useful, too deeply embedded in human psychology. When the Romans conquered Egypt, they didn't abolish the pharaonic system, they adopted it. Roman emperors styled themselves as pharaohs when in Egypt, performing the ancient rituals, claiming the divine titles. Julius Caesar and Mark Antony both had relationships with Cleopatra, perhaps hoping to tie their bloodlines to the ancient divine legacy. And when Rome eventually fell, the idea of sacred bloodlines didn't disappear, it just transformed. The throne of the gods didn't vanish, it just moved. From the Nile to the Tiber, from Rome to Constantinople, and eventually to the capitals of Europe. Because the royal families of Europe would soon make a claim so audacious that it would allow them to rule for centuries. They claimed descent from the same divine bloodline that produced the pharaohs. The same bloodline that stretched back to Mesopotamia. The same bloodline that the gods themselves had created. And they had the genealogies to prove it. Here's where the story gets really interesting, because we're about to see how an ancient Near Eastern belief system somehow became the foundation for European monarchy, how the divine bloodlines of Mesopotamia and Egypt ended up being claimed by kings in Britain, France, Germany, and beyond. And the key to understanding this isn't found in history books. It's found in mythology, in the stories that royal families told about themselves. There's a medieval legend about a princess named Scota, daughter of an Egyptian pharaoh, who supposedly fled Egypt and brought the Stone of Destiny to Ireland and Scotland. This same stone remains part of the British coronation ceremony to this day, housed beneath the coronation chair in Westminster Abbey. Is this story historical? Almost certainly not. But here's what matters. The royal families believed it. They claimed Egyptian descent. They claimed connection to the ancient pharaonic bloodline. Why? Because it gave them legitimacy. It said, our right to rule doesn't come from military conquest alone. It comes from blood that stretches back before Christianity, before Rome, all the way to the gods themselves. Every major European royal house had similar founding myths. The Romans claimed descent from Aeneas, a Trojan prince who was the son of Venus. When Troy fell, Aeneas fled to Italy, and his descendants founded Rome. This myth was so important that Virgil wrote the entire Aeneid to establish it, creating a divine genealogy for Julius Caesar's family, who claimed direct descent from Venus herself. The pattern repeated across Europe. The Britons claimed descent from Brutus of Troy. The Franks claimed descent from Francus, another Trojan prince. The Anglo-Saxon kings traced their lineage to Woden. The Scandinavian dynasties claimed descent from Odin and Freyr. Different names, different regions, but always the same core claim: divine ancestry. And always the same symbols. Look at European heraldry: eagles, lions, dragons, serpents, the sun. These aren't random choices. These are the exact same symbols used by ancient Mesopotamians and Egyptians to represent divine authority. The Order of the Dragon, founded in 1408, was a real knightly organization whose members included Vlad II Dracul, whose name literally means Vlad the Dragon. His son would be known as Vlad III Dracula, son of the dragon. Why would a Christian order use the dragon as its symbol when Christianity portrays dragons as evil? Because the dragon didn't originally represent evil, it represented ancient power, royal bloodline, connection to forces older than Christianity itself. But here's what really seals this connection: the marriage patterns. Just like the Pharaohs, European royalty practiced strict endogamy. They married within their class, creating an increasingly interconnected web of bloodlines. By the 19th and 20th centuries, virtually every royal house in Europe was related to every other. Queen Victoria became known as the grandmother of Europe because her children and grandchildren married into nearly every royal family. The result? When World War I broke out, the leaders of the three main warring powers, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and King George V of Britain, were all first cousins. They called each other by family nicknames. They were literally family, despite leading nations that were killing each other by the millions. Think about that. A family dispute that killed millions. The Habsburg dynasty took endogamy to such extremes that Charles II of Spain, who died in 1700, was so inbred that modern genetic analysis shows his inbreeding coefficient was higher than if his parents had been siblings. He had a Habsburg jaw, so pronounced he could barely eat. He was likely sterile. He died at 38 from complications that were almost certainly genetic. Why would they do this? Why risk genetic catastrophe for for bloodline purity, because to them, the blood mattered more than the body. The divine essence had to be preserved, even if the vessel carrying it was weak. Even today, we see echoes of this obsession. When Edward VIII wanted to marry an American divorcee in 1936, he had to abdicate the throne. Why? Because the bloodline had to be protected. The British royal family's genealogy is one of the most meticulously documented in the world. They can trace their line back through William the Conqueror, back to the Anglo-Saxon kings, back to Woden. Every remaining European monarchy maintains similar records. But it's not just the monarchies. A 12-year-old girl once demonstrated that 42 of the first 43 US presidents could be traced back to King John of England. And King John traces his line back through the very genealogies we've been discussing. These aren't coincidences. These are patterns maintained deliberately over centuries. Now let's talk about a phrase everyone knows, but few understand: blue blood. We use it to mean aristocracy, but where does it come from? The traditional explanation is that it refers to Spanish nobility whose pale skin showed their blue veins more clearly than the darker-skinned Moors. But this is almost certainly a later rationalization. In alchemical and esoteric texts that the nobility studied, blue blood represented celestial origin. The gods were said to have blood that was not red like human blood, but blue like the sky from which they came. Blue represented the heavenly realm. When European nobility used the term blue blood, they were claiming their blood traced back to the celestial, to the divine. The bloodline that began in Sumer, that was institutionalized in Egypt, that spread through Troy and Rome to Europe, is still here. Still concentrated in the same families, still jealously guarded, and still, according to those families, special, divine, superior. Now let's talk about something that sounds like it should be conspiracy theory, but is actually documented fact. Something you can verify yourself with a few hours of genealogical research. I'm talking about how virtually every royal house currently sitting on a European throne can trace their bloodline back to the same small group of ancestors, and how those ancestors meticulously traced their lines back to the ancient world we've been discussing. This isn't speculation. This is recorded history, maintained in official royal genealogies, heraldic records, and peer-reviewed historical scholarship. Let's start with the most famous example, the British royal family. Their official genealogy, maintained by the College of Arms and various royal historians, doesn't just go back a few generations. It goes back over 1,000 years with documented precision. And where it can't be documented with absolute certainty, there are carefully constructed claims that bridge the gaps. The current King Charles III traces his line through his mother Elizabeth II, back through the House of Windsor, which was previously called the House of Saxe-Coburg, and Gotha, before they changed the name during World War I because it sounded too German. Before that, the House of Hanover. Before that, the House of Stuart. Before that, the Tudors. Before that, the Plantagenets. The Plantagenet line connects to the Norman conquest and William the Conqueror, and William's genealogy was traced back through the Dukes of Normandy, who were themselves descendants of Viking raiders who had mixed with Frankish nobility. Those Viking lines go back to the Scandinavian royal houses who claimed descent from Odin. But that's not where it ends. The Norman line also connects through marriage to the Anglo-Saxon royal houses of England, who trace their lineage to Woden, the Anglo-Saxon version of Odin. The genealogies of kings like Alfred the Great explicitly list Woden as an ancestor, not metaphorically, but as part of their actual family tree. And here's where it gets really interesting. The European royal houses didn't just maintain their own genealogies, they studied each other's. They compared notes, they found connections, and they married specifically to unite these bloodlines. Take a look at the descendants of Queen Victoria, who ruled Britain from 1837 to 1901. Her strategic marriage arrangements created what historians call the royal mob, an interconnected web of European royalty, all related by blood. Her eldest daughter, Victoria, married Frederick III of Germany, making her the mother of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Her second daughter, Alice, married into the German House of Hesse, and her descendants include Prince Philip, the recently deceased husband of Elizabeth II, which means the current British royals carry this line twice over. Her third child, Edward VII, became King of Britain, and his descendants continue the British line. Her fourth child, Alfred, became Duke of Edinburgh and married into Russian royalty. Her fifth child, Helena, married into German royalty. Her sixth child, Louise, married into Scottish nobility, with connections to ancient Scottish royal lines. Her seventh child, Arthur, married into Prussian royalty. Her eighth child, Leopold, married into German nobility, and his daughter would marry into Swedish royalty. Her youngest child, Beatrice, married into Spanish royalty, and her descendants include the current Spanish royal family. Do you see what happened? In 3 generations, Victoria's blood spread into nearly every royal house in Europe. By World War I, the King of Britain, the Kaiser of Germany, and the Tsar of Russia were all first cousins. They called each other by family nicknames. They were literally family, despite leading nations that were killing each other by the millions. But Victoria didn't start this practice. She was continuing a tradition that had been going on for centuries. The Habsburg dynasty of Austria-Hungary practiced it so extensively that they had a saying, "Let others wage war, but you, happy Austria, shall marry." Through strategic marriages, the Habsburgs built an empire that controlled most of Europe without major military conquest. The Spanish Habsburgs took this to such an extreme that Charles II of Spain, who died in 1700, was so inbred that his Habsburg jaw was so pronounced he could barely eat, and he was likely sterile due to genetic problems. His official cause of death was listed as bewitchment, but modern analysis of his genealogy shows that his inbreeding coefficient was higher than if his parents had been siblings. That's not a typo. His family tree had collapsed so many times that he was more inbred than a brother-sister pairing would produce. Why would they do this? Why risk genetic catastrophe for bloodline purity? Because to them, the blood mattered more than the body. The divine essence had to be preserved, even if the vessel carrying it was weak. Now let's look at the current state of European royalty and see just how connected they all are. King Charles III of Britain is related to King Harold V of Norway through multiple lines, but most directly through Edward VII. He's related to King Felipe VI of Spain through Victoria's line. He's related to King Carl XVI Gustaf of Sweden through Victoria's line, and also through the Bernadotte dynasty that took the Swedish throne in 1818. He's related to Queen Margrethe II of Denmark through multiple connections, including Christian IX of Denmark, who was called the father-in-law of Europe because his children married into so many royal houses. He's related to King Willem-Alexander of the Netherlands through multiple lines. He's related to King Philippe of Belgium. He's related to the Grand Duke of Luxembourg. In fact, if you map out the genealogies of every current reigning European monarch, you find that they all connect within just a few generations. They are literally one extended family, scattered across different countries, speaking different languages, but all carrying the same carefully preserved bloodlines. And here's something fascinating. When European royalty lost their thrones, they didn't stop maintaining these connections. The deposed royal families of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Greece, Romania, they all still exist. They still maintain their genealogies, they still use their titles, even if they have no political power. And they still marry within the same circles. The current claimant to the Russian throne, if the monarchy were restored, is Grand Duchess Maria Vladimirovna. She's related to the British royal family, to the Greek royal family, to the Spanish royal family. The bloodline persists even when the throne is gone. Now let's talk about a phrase that everyone knows, but few understand: blue blood. In Spanish, it's sangre azul. We use it to mean aristocracy, nobility, upper class. But where does it come from? The traditional explanation is that it comes from the Spanish nobility, whose pale skin allowed their blue veins to show more clearly than those of the darker-skinned Moors. But this is almost certainly a later rationalization. The actual origin is far more interesting and far more esoteric. In ancient traditions, particularly in the alchemical and esoteric texts that the nobility studied, blue blood represented celestial origin. The gods, the divine beings, were said to have blood that was not red, like human blood, but blue like the sky from which they came. This wasn't meant to be taken literally in terms of actual color, but symbolically. Blue represented the heavenly realm, the celestial sphere, the domain of the gods. When European nobility began using the term blue blood, they were making a claim. They were saying, our blood is not common human blood. Our blood traces back to the celestial, to the divine, to the gods themselves. This is why the obsession with genealogy isn't just about pride or snobbery. It's about maintaining what they believe is a genuine spiritual and genetic connection to the divine origins of kingship. Look at how royal genealogies are constructed. They don't just list names and dates. They trace bloodlines with the precision of a scientific experiment. They note which lines are patrilineal, which are matrilineal. They track titles and how they pass through inheritance. They document which marriages were morganatic, meaning unequal, and therefore produced children who couldn't inherit the full bloodline claim. The College of Arms in Britain, the Office of the Chief Herald of Ireland, the various heraldic institutions across Europe, they exist for one purpose: to maintain and verify bloodline claims. They are essentially genetic record keepers for the aristocracy, maintaining a database of who is related to whom, who has the right to which titles, who carries which bloodlines. And this isn't just a European phenomenon. When you look at other royal traditions around the world, you see the same patterns. The Imperial House of Japan claims unbroken descent from Emperor Jimmu, who supposedly ascended to the throne in 660 BC, and through him to the sun goddess Amaterasu. That's a claimed bloodline of over 2,600 years. Whether it's literally true or not is less important than the fact that they've maintained this claim and built an entire cultural and religious system around it. The Dalai Lamas of Tibet represent a different model, but with the same underlying principle. Each Dalai Lama is believed to be the reincarnation of the previous one, which means the same divine essence, the same spiritual bloodline, if you will, passes from body to body. When one Dalai Lama dies, they search for the child who carries his reincarnated essence. It's bloodline transmission through spiritual rather than genetic means, but it's the same concept. Divine authority is inherited, not earned. The Ethiopian royal family, the Solomonic dynasty, claimed descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, connecting them both to biblical divine lineage and to ancient African kingdoms. Even after Haile Selassie was deposed in 1974, ending the monarchy, the family maintains this genealogical claim. What we're seeing is a global pattern Across cultures, across religions, across continents, ruling families claim descent from gods or divine figures. And they maintain these claims even when they've lost political power. The genealogies persist, the records are kept, the bloodlines are traced. This isn't random. This isn't coincidence. This is a deliberate, sustained effort spanning thousands of years to maintain something these families believe is real and important. Modern genetics has actually made this more interesting, not less. DNA analysis has confirmed some surprising connections. For example, genetic studies of European populations have found that a surprisingly large percentage of people with European ancestry are descended from Charlemagne. One study suggested that virtually everyone of European descent is descended from Charlemagne if you go back enough generations. But here's the key. While commoners might have some distant genetic connection to ancient royalty, the royal families maintain concentrated bloodlines through intermarriage. A peasant might have 0.001% of their DNA from Charlemagne. A current European royal might have 15% or more. The concentration matters to them, the purity matters. And they're not stopping. Even today, even in our supposedly modern era, royal marriages are still carefully arranged, still focused on maintaining bloodline connections. When Prince William married Catherine Middleton, it was treated as revolutionary because she was a commoner. But dig into her ancestry and you find connections to British nobility, just not the highest ranks. The bloodline expanded slightly, but didn't break. The obsession continues. The genealogies are still maintained, the symbols are still used, the claims of special ancestry are still made, just more quietly, more subtly than in the age of divine right monarchy, because that's what we're really talking about here. Not a conspiracy, but an obsession. An obsession inherited across centuries and millennia. An obsession that says we are not like other people. We carry something special, something divine, something that traces back to when gods walked the earth. Whether that's true or not, whether there's any reality to it beyond belief and psychology, is almost irrelevant, because the belief itself has shaped human civilization. The belief itself has determined who rules and who serves. The belief itself has been powerful enough to survive the fall of empires, the rise of democracy, the scientific revolution. The bloodline persists because those who carry it refuse to let it die, and they pass that obsession to their children generation after generation, maintaining an idea that began in ancient Mesopotamia and continues in the palaces and boardrooms of today. Now we need to talk about what blood actually represents in these ancient traditions. Because when we talk about bloodlines and divine ancestry, we're not just talking about genetics in the modern scientific sense. We're talking about something deeper. Blood, in the esoteric traditions maintained by these families, is not just a biological substance. Blood is memory. Blood is continuity. Blood is the physical carrier of spiritual essence. In virtually every ancient culture, blood held sacred significance far beyond its biological function. The ancient Egyptians believed the heart, animated by blood, contained the person's essence and memories. In Hebrew tradition, the life of a creature is in its blood. The Greeks believed in philosophic blood, a subtle spiritual essence that carried consciousness and divine spark. This is the context we need when these royal families talk about bloodline. They're not just talking about DNA. They're talking about an unbroken chain of consciousness, memory, and divine connection that passes from parent to child through the medium of blood. Think about the symbolism that has remained constant for thousands of years. Red represents life force, power, and divine essence. Why do kings wear red robes? Why is red the color of cardinals? Why do we roll out red carpets? Because red is the color of blood, and blood represents life and sacred authority. Blue represents the celestial realm, the heavens, the domain of the gods. When royalty mixes red and blue in their symbolism, they're making a statement: we are the union of earth and heaven, of mortal blood and celestial essence. Royal purple, incredibly expensive to produce in ancient times, is literally the mixing of red and blue. Human blood blended with celestial essence, the visual representation of divine bloodline. Now let's decode the symbols that appear in royal heraldry. The dragon, or serpent, represents ancient wisdom and divine power. But esoterically, it represents the Kundalini, the serpent energy that lies dormant in humans. Royal families use dragon symbolism to claim they carry this energy in their bloodline, already awakened, already connected to higher realms. The eagle represents the solar principle and the ability to soar above mortal concerns. Esoterically, it represents alchemical sublimation, the transformation of base material into spiritual essence. When royalty uses eagle symbolism, they're claiming their blood has been elevated above common human blood. The lion represents solar kingship and the heart, the seat of nobility. The lion is king of beasts, as the sun is king of celestial bodies. Royal families use lion symbolism to claim their bloodline carries solar essence. Wings represent the ability to transcend the material world, the divine spark that can rise above earthly limitations. They represent the claim that this bloodline isn't fully bound by earthly laws. The sun itself appears constantly in royal symbolism. It represents divine consciousness, eternal life, and cosmic authority. When a king claims solar symbolism, he's claiming his consciousness is aligned with the divine light that illuminates the cosmos. Blood sacrifice in ancient cultures was the ultimate offering to the gods because blood represented life itself. But the king himself was often the primary sacrifice, not literally killed, but ritually identified with the sacrifice. The king's blood connects earth to heaven, human to divine. In Hermetic and alchemical traditions, which European noble families studied intensively, there's a concept of philosophical Mercury, the carrier of consciousness and memory across time and space. In the human body, blood is considered its physical manifestation. Blood carries not just oxygen and nutrients, but information, memory, and spiritual essence. When you inherit blood from your parents, you're inheriting memory, consciousness patterns, and spiritual connections that stretch back through your entire ancestry. Modern science is actually catching up to this ancient understanding. Epigenetics shows that experiences can modify gene expression, and these modifications can be inherited. Trauma studies show that severe experiences can leave markers on DNA that pass to subsequent generations. The royal families have always believed this. They believe their blood carries the memory of divine origin, that every ancestor who carried this blood enriched it, passing down not just genetic material, but consciousness, knowledge, and divine connection. This is why they're so obsessive about bloodline purity. It's not just about preventing genetic defects, it's about preventing dilution of the divine memory carried in the blood. Every time the bloodline mixes with common blood, they believe the divine signal gets weaker. Think about it like a signal being transmitted. If you want to keep it pure and strong, you don't mix it with noise. You amplify it, refine it, keep it clear. That's how these families think about bloodline. The rituals around royal blood reflect this understanding. Blood oaths, where individuals mix their blood, create a bond more sacred than any contract because it's mixing life essence, creating shared memory and destiny. The chalice or grail represents the vessel that holds sacred blood. The Holy Grail symbolizes the container of divine bloodline itself. Royal lineage documents are treated like sacred texts because they're maps of consciousness and memory flowing through time. The crown, placed on the head during coronation, represents the opening of the crown chakra, the point where divine consciousness enters the human form. Why do royal families often seem to have knowledge that others don't? Why do they understand how power really works in ways ordinary people don't grasp? Maybe it's just good education and insider access. But maybe when you carry an unbroken bloodline, stretching back thousands of years, with each generation studying the same esoteric knowledge, performing the same rituals, maintaining the same connections, maybe something really does get passed down beyond what we can currently measure. This is why the reptilian symbolism keeps appearing. The serpent, the dragon. These aren't literal descriptions, they're symbolic representations of ancient consciousness, of memory that stretches back before recorded history. When you see a coat of arms with dragons and serpents, you're seeing a family claiming they carry ancient memory, ancient wisdom, ancient connection to the divine. The solar symbols, the all-seeing eyes, the pyramids, they all represent the same concept: illumination, divine consciousness. The light that shines from the source, passed down through bloodline into the present moment. Whether any of this is objectively real, whether there's actual divine essence flowing through these veins, is less important than understanding that they believe it. They act on it. They structure their entire existence around maintaining it. The bloodline isn't just a family tree, it's a river of consciousness flowing through time, carrying memory from the age when gods walked the earth to the present day. That's what they're really protecting, not just power, not just wealth, but memory. Divine memory, the remembrance of what humanity was, what it came from, and what these bloodlines believe it can become again. If you strip away the pageantry, the titles, the marble halls and velvet curtains, what remains is an idea older than empires. That blood is not just life, but memory, a current carrying identity, allegiance, and a story about where power truly comes from. Across tablets and tombs, heraldry and hymns, the claim barely changes. Some lines insist they were chosen. Some say they were made. Others whisper they were remembered into being. And whether or not the gods ever walked among men is almost beside the point. What matters is how faithfully that belief has been guarded, how relentlessly it has shaped marriages, wars, coronations, and the quiet engineering of the future. Look closely, and you'll notice something unsettling. The symbols didn't fade. They adapted. The dragon became an emblem. The sun became a seal. The serpent became a brand of wisdom. What used to be chiseled into stone now hides in logos, medals, currencies, and ceremonies so familiar we no longer see them. The language of divine blood learned to speak modern. But here's the question: the old rites can't avoid forever. If blood is memory, whose memory are we preserving? Because there are two lineages running through human history. One is biological: names, dates, treaties, the visible tree. The other is conceptual: the myths that tell us who we are and who is allowed to rule. Dynasties can fall and still win if the story survives in our heads. Maybe that's the final secret. Maybe power doesn't need temples if people carry the temple inside them. Maybe the greatest ritual was never the crowning of a king, but the moment a civilization agreed that some lives were closer to heaven than others. So what do we do with a story that refuses to die. We name it. We see it. We stop mistaking inheritance for destiny. We recognize that divine right is only as strong as the memory we continue to feed it. And we ask a harder question, one the old families have asked for 1,000 years, but never for us. What do you remember? What truths are alive in your blood? Traumas, talents, loyalties you did not choose, but can still transform. If blood is memory, then memory can be healed, rewritten, redeemed. The same current that bound kingdoms can free individuals. The same symbols that crowned empires can become mirrors, showing us not what we were told to be, but what we could become when we stop outsourcing our origin to the past. In the end, the guardians of old believed they protected a fragment of the divine. Perhaps they did. But here is the heresy their world fears most. That divinity was never a pedigree, it was a responsibility. And it does not end with them. When the procession ends and the lights go out, the question remains. Quiet, patient, unforgiving. Will we keep remembering the story that kept us small, or will we finally remember ourselves?